This video is about solving quadratic equations by completing the square. So before we get into the topic, we're going to do a warm-up question together, which is to solve this equation x squared minus 6x plus 9 equals 16 using two different methods. So method one is going to be to try to solve this by factoring. That's one of the methods we have had so far. The first was to solve by graphing, which we said is not the best way to do. So we're going to solve by factoring. And to do that, it has to equal 0 on the one side. So we're going to subtract 16 from both sides. And then we would get x squared minus 6x minus 7 equals 0. So now I can factor that. So I want two numbers that multiply to -7 and add to -6. So that would be -7 and +1, which means my factors are x minus 7 and x plus 1. And now using the zero product property, we would have x equals 7 or x equals -1. Now method two, I'm going to do something a little bit different. But method two, I recognize that this x squared minus 6x plus 9 is actually a perfect square trinomial. Remember, to see if it's a perfect square trinomial, you take the square root of the first part, the square root of the second part, and then that middle term needs to be 2 times the first part times the second part. So 2 times x times 3 is 6x. So I'm recognizing that this is going to be x minus 3 squared. And if it's x minus 3 squared equals 16, now I can square root both sides, which gives me x minus 3 equals positive or -4. I can add 3 to both sides. And I just need to do this twice to get my two different answers. So first time around, it's going to be x equals +4 plus 3, which is 7. And then the other time around, it's going to be x equals -4 plus 3. So our two answers are x equals 7 and x equals -1, which is what we got before, which makes sense. Now this worked out really nicely because on the left-hand side, we had this set of terms, which ended up being that perfect square trinomial. So this leads us into our next method of solving quadratics, which I said was completing the square. Now the problem is, it's very lucky that there was a +9 there and it worked out. But we can manipulate equations and add things and move things around to make it look like a perfect square trinomial on that one side, which will then allow us to write it as the square of a binomial, which will then allow us to square root both sides. So that's the goal here. Okay, so before we actually get into some equations, let's just talk about that value that we are going to put there that to make it a perfect square trinomial. So remember some examples are x squared minus 6x plus 9, what we just did. That led to x minus 3 squared, x squared plus 8x plus 16. Okay, this is x, this is 4, this is 2 times x times 4. So that was x plus 4 squared. And this one is x, that's 1, and the middle term is 2 times x times 1. So that was x minus 1 squared. Remember that c term will always be positive because no matter what number is there at the end of the binomial, when you multiply it by itself, it gives you a positive number. But that sign of the middle term does determine the sign of the binomial. So because it was minus 6x, this one was -3. This was plus 8x, so this was +4. And this was minus 2x, so the binomial was -1. So because that middle term is 2 times the first thing times the second thing, what we can do to find this piece, in this case when all our a values are 1, we're going to divide b by 2 and then square it. Okay, so you'll see over here, this is 6 divided by 3, which is, 6 divided by 2, which is 3, and 3 squared is 9. 8 divided by 2 is 4, 4 squared is 16. I should have technically said -6 over here. -2 divided by 2 is -1, squared is 1. So for over here, we want to find the value of c that completes the square. So we're going to take b, which is 12, and divide it by 2 to get 6, and then square it. So our c value that completes the square is 36. So if it was x squared plus 12x plus 36, now we could take that and write it as the square of a binomial. That's the goal. For this one, it's not going to work out so nicely because it is an odd number, but it's still doable. We're going to take our -9, which is our b, divide it by 2, and then we're going to take -9/2 and square it, which means -9/2 times -9/2, and we get a c of 81/4. So it is possible that we will be dealing with some fractions here. It won't be that bad though. So now that we've figured out how to figure out the c, okay, let's actually solve some equations. Okay, I did try to provide you with some notes that are hopefully going to help you as you do these on your own. So x squared minus 14x plus 16 equals 0. Our first step says move the constant to the right. So to get rid of our positive 16, we will add 16 to both sides, subtract 16 from both sides. X squared minus 14x. I'm going to leave a little space here because I'm going to put a new number there. So we have x squared minus 14x, and then equals -16. Okay, now this allows us to look at what we have on that left-hand side and complete the square. Okay, we could probably have looked at it originally and figured it out, but honestly, it's just easier to move that constant over and kind of start fresh. So we have x squared minus 14x. To find that value that completes the square, we're going to take the b term, which is -14, divide it by 2, which would be -7, and then square it. So we're going to put a positive 49 there. But the rule of equations is whatever you do to one side, you have to put it on both sides. So if we added 49 to the left side, we must also add 49 to that right side. So now on the left, we're going to take that trinomial and we're going to write it as the square of a binomial. So that would be x minus, because of that, x minus 7 squared. On the right side, we're just going to add those constants together. So that is 33. And now I can square root both sides and continue to solve. So I get x minus 7 equals positive or negative. I'm just going to leave it as root 33 because I can't evaluate it nicely. I can't simplify it. And then we're going to add 7 to both sides. And x equals, and remember from our video the other day that the most common way of writing this is to take the constant first. So say 7 plus or minus root 33. And that is our answer. Let's try another one. Okay, here we have x squared plus 5x minus 7 equals 0. We're going to start by moving that constant over by adding 7 to both sides. So we get x squared plus 5x, leave a little space, equals 7. Now we need to find the value that is going to complete the square. So we take our b, which is 5, divided by 2, which is 5/2. And then we're going to square that. So our value that completes the square is 25/4. 5/2 times 5/2. But if we're adding it to the left side, oops, we must also add it to the right side. Okay, now I can write this left-hand side as a perfect square, the square of a binomial. So it's going to be x plus 5/2 squared. Over here, 7 really equals 28/4. So I can combine those together to get 53/4. And now I can square root both sides. I get x plus 5/2 equals positive or negative root 53/4. I can subtract 5/2 from both sides. And we're going to write this in a couple different ways. Okay, so our first one, I'm going to go over here because I ran out of room. I'm going to say x equals negative 5 halves plus or minus root 53 over 4. Okay, or another way of writing that is we can actually simplify that radical because on the bottom it's root 4. So really we can think of this as root 53 over root 4. So another way of saying this is x equals negative 5 over 2 plus or minus root 53 over root 4, which happens to be 2. Or another way is now technically I have two fractions with a denominator of 2. I can actually put those things together. So I can say x equals negative 5 plus or minus root 53. That is all over 2. Okay, this is technically the best way of writing it, but I know some of us aren't super confident with simplifying radicals right now, but this is the best way. Okay, now those had a values of 1. There was no coefficient at the front of it. So now what do we do when we have a coefficient out front with the x squared? It's really going to be the same steps as before. The exception is first, you're just going to divide everything by the a. So here, we're going to take this and divide everything by 2, which gives us x squared plus 12x minus 2 equals 0. And now it's exactly the same thing as before. So I'm going to add 2 to move my constant over. I get x squared plus 12x, leave a little space, equals 2. I need to find the number that completes the square. Take b divided by 2, which is 6. Square that is 36, but do it to both sides. My left side is really x plus 6 squared. My right side is 38. Now I can square root both sides. I get x plus 6 equals positive or negative root 38. Can't simplify that one at all. And now subtract 6 from both sides means my final answer will be x equals negative 6 plus or minus root 38. Okay. For this one, we're going to divide everything by 5. So we get n squared minus 3/5 n, doesn't seem fun, minus 3 equal to 0. Now we can add 3 to both sides. So we get n squared minus 3/5 n, leave some space, equal to 3. Okay, now we need to figure out how to complete this square. Now, the b is negative 3/5. We said you take the b and divide it by 2. But in this case, since we have a fraction, it's going to be helpful to realize that dividing by 2 is really the same thing as multiplying by a half. We're taking half of that b. So we're going to do negative 3/5 times a half, which is negative 3/10. But now we need to take that and square it. So negative 3/10 squared is going to be 9 over 100. So that's the value that completes the square. I'm going to add it to both sides because whatever you do to one side, you do the other. Which means this mess over here on the left is really n minus, this was from the 3/10, so n minus 3/10 squared. 3 is really 300 over 100. So putting those together gives us 309 over 100. Now I can square root both sides. So n minus 3/10 equals positive or negative root 309 over 100. And then we can add 3/10 to both sides. And this is going to be another one where there's multiple ways of writing our answer. The most basic way right now is n equals 3/10 plus or minus root 309 over 100. However, you can actually do root 100. So a slightly better way would be n equals 3/10 plus or minus root 309 over 10. And an even better way is because they both have a 10 as a denominator, n equals 3 plus or minus root 309 over 10. And that's the best way. Okay, and our last examples here, okay. Completing the square is actually a helpful way of taking an equation in standard form and writing it in vertex form. So we have y equals x squared minus 8x plus 11. Notice there's no constant on this side now because we're dealing with a function, a quadratic function. But we're going to start the same way. So we're going to subtract 11 on both sides. They're not like terms though, so we'll just say y minus 11 equals x squared. Hold on, I want to leave a little space there. So y minus 11 equals x squared minus 8x. And now we can complete the square. So half of b would be -4. -4 squared is a positive 16. We add it to both sides. And we end up on this side with y plus 5 by combining those together. This is going to be x minus 4 squared. And now final step, we really want y equals. So we're going to move this number back over. And we get y equals x minus 4 squared minus 5. And now it's in vertex form, which would tell us that the vertex is 4, -5. Axis of symmetry would be x equals 4. So you can go from there. And our last example, vertex form, but with a coefficient out front. It's going to be a slight bit different because we don't want to just divide everything by that coefficient now because we have a y there. We don't have a number. We're not solving it. So it's going to be slightly different than what we did on the examples above. But we are going to start again by subtracting this constant to move it over. So we get y minus 5 equals -4x squared plus 16x. And now I should note that our vertex form was something like y equals x minus h squared plus k. So we do need to have this number, this coefficient out front of some parentheses. So to get that, we are actually going to factor out that -4. So we're going to factor out that -4, which will leave us with x squared, not plus. It's going to be x squared minus 4x. And this is going to be where we actually end up completing the square. So we have y minus 5. Sorry, leave some space. Y minus 5 equals -4 times x squared minus 4x. And we're going to take half of that, so -2, and square it and put that there. But the difference here is we didn't just add 4 to this right-hand side, because that 4 we put there is on the inside of the parentheses, which really means we are doing this -4 times that +4. That's what we added to that right-hand side. So that would be -16. So on that left-hand side, we need to write -16. Okay, -16 is really what we put on both sides there. So combine our like terms. Over here we get y minus 21. Over here it's going to be -4. And now I can do my square of a binomial, which would be x minus 2 squared. And now my last step is to add that 21 back over to get y by itself. And y equals -4 times x minus 2 squared plus 21. Okay. It's kind of cool how you can go back and forth between the different forms of quadratic functions. But I would say the main thing to get out of this one is making sure you know how to find solutions to those equations. using the completing the square method.